experiment tonight because as an outreach program in the University of Cincinnati, we decided to reach out other local institutions who are also committed to bring cultural contents throughout and reaching the widest audience possible. So tonight you will see the music will help us starting and finishing our journey in Athens. And I'm hoping we'll set up the tone and the mood for our journey back in time and back in space. So without further ado, I will introduce to you this clip that we recorded at the music hall, at the Cincinnati Music Hall with the symphony orchestra, the amazing symphony orchestra. And again, if you close your eyes, I'm hoping you will feel, thanks to Debussy, that we are transported back in Greece somehow. Peaceful, beautiful music, everything seems so quiet and good, is not gonna last. It's not gonna be our case. But we're setting up the tone for our story. And our story indeed involves Greece, but Greece at large, we would say. Why? Because we start in Miletus, right here in Ionia, a beautiful city. We will be talking about Miletus shortly. But then, obviously, we move to the mainland, to Greece mainland, and we will go to Athens, where there is a new chapter, a lot of changes, a lot of dynamism. We will see what that means. All of that we will be talking about tonight goes back to the classical era of Greek civilization, so the 5th century before Christ, BCE. And of course, we will try to zoom in and zoom out. We will start by looking at the broader context. What does it mean to live in the Athenian democracy? How the Athenian democracy came into being? And then we will look more closely at one character, the character through her eyes. We will see everything growing up and how Athens changes throughout the classical age. And this character is a woman, and her name is Aspasia, Aspasia of Miletus. So we have to go back. We have to go back in Ionia, those cities facing the Aegean Sea in Turkey. And Miletus It's a great city. It's one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. It's a melting pot. It's a place where different cultures are interacting with each other. Not just the Greek culture, but also the Oriental culture, with the Lydian kingdom and then the Persian Empire, of course. There is prosperity, there is wealth, two harbors, so plenty of trade. So it's a vibrant city, a very dynamic city, and it's right actually the birthplace of philosophy and science as we think of it today. The first thinkers who decided to investigate the world not by calling upon the gods, but actually by looking at phenomena, natural phenomena, looking at reasonable explanation. Everything started in Miletus, back in Ionia, and it's in this vibrant city that Aspasia is born. But again, Ionia is this area facing Greece, obviously, but also in between other great powers. And one of those is the Persian Empire. And you can really see from its extension why it has been called one of the greatest empires of the ancient history. It's massive. And obviously, Ionia, which was before taken by another kingdom, Lydia, ended up becoming just one of the many provinces of this large multi-territorial empire encompassing different populations with different religions and different customs. So a new era for Ionia, obviously. So a new era for Miletus as well. And that's how one of the most known pages of ancient history is born. The Persian Wars. We all know what that means, right? The contrast between the West and the East. But of course, we have to look at what is the impact of the confrontation between the Persian Empire and the Greeks on the Greek mindset. Because the Greeks, surprisingly, were able to defeat the Persian Empire twice. One in Marathon, a terrestrial battle, and another time with a naval battle at Salamis, right in front of Athens. Again, imagine the impact. One tiny city-state defeating one of the greatest empires of all history. You can imagine how was the feeling among the Greeks who were able to succeed, to do the unthinkable, defeating the king of the kings. And in fact, we didn't need to look back to Homer, to Achilles, Hector, because actually history became more alluring and more appealing than myth itself. So the new heroes for the Greeks of the classical age were actually their contemporaries. Do not be, so dismissive. I know that you have watched 300, and I thought was a nice picture. Of course, we all have in mind Leonidas leading, the Spartan king leading the 300, right? And still being defeated by Xerxes, but of course, leaving this page of heroism, being able to sacrifice everything if you can stop the Persian Empire. So stopping an empire and defending the freedom of the Greek polis, the cities. But of course, the maximum impact of these victories has been for Athens itself. The city was able to feel a boost of confidence because it was able to do the unthinkable, defeating the Persians twice. And so we see that Athens changes perspective completely. From a tiny city-state, the city becomes the leader of a coalition, the leader of a new league called the Delian League, from one of those tiny islands in Ionia, Delos. And of course, when you change status, when your perspective suddenly becomes so broad and so wide, you need to celebrate this new achievement, this new milestone of your civic identity. And that's how we have Athens putting up a sort of an artistic makeover, new monuments, so that all the citizens can actually visualize that times are changing and history, that they made history, because history is incredibly different now. So that's how the Parthenon, the new temple to Athena Parthenos, the goddess, the virgin goddess of Athena, comes into being. And of course, remember that when the Persians came to the mainland, they actually sacked Athens twice. And what we mean by sacking, we also mean that they were burning to the ground every temple of the Greeks that they found. So obviously, an earlier temple of Athena has been burned to the ground. And for years, the Athenians thought that they were not going to build ever again. They thought this could have been a sign for the citizens to remember those dark times. And then they decided that they wanted to build something bigger, more grandiose, to surpass the past, to show that this is a new era, that after the destruction of the Persians, a new chapter is starting. And that's how we had the Parthenon. But again, don't be deceived. This is not just art for the art's sake. This is not a museum. This is, again, a very subtle political message. Because if you look at the decorations, you will see that these are not just myths. They are retellings of what has just happened. Of course, the mythical events in the decoration are alluding to proverbial facts of myth, and all pointing to a dichotomy, a clash between order and disorder, between the forces against civilization and the forces who are helping civilization to develop. And of course, when we think about disorder and we look at the Parthenon, we see the Amazons, we see the giants, we see the centaurs, all those bestial creatures. But the message is very subtle. These are not just creatures of myth. This is a reference to the Persians. The Persians are becoming the new enemy, and the Athenians are portraying themselves, bringing new order to the disorder that the Persians were trying to throw upon Greece. And of course, this clash is not just about order and disorder, but it's also about an empire with the king of the kings, the Persian one, and then a new form of government, the democracy. The democracy that we talked about every day, even right now, it's a Greek word. We're speaking in Greek because it actually comes from demos, right? The people at large. And kratos, the power. The power finally is not given to the people who are aristocrats, who are the best in society, the aristocracy. They're given to the people at large, of course. So every measure is sorted by either election, in the case of the most prestigious offices, or by lot, or by raising our hand. This is how democracy started. But of course, there is always the danger that some individual, a talented individual, can overthrow the democracy and become the biggest personality on the arena. And that's how the Greeks, the Athenians, actually invented the ostracism. We talk about people who are ostracized. We're talking in Greek, once again. The ostraca that you see here are pieces of broken pottery, and on those pieces, they were actually writing down the name of this outstanding personality that they were hoping they could cast out of Athens just for 10 years, so that the democracy could be preserved for the moment. Ostracism, keeping away the person who can maybe aspire to become a tyrant, and preserving the order, preserving the rule of the people. But of course, the main institution that we all connect immediately to democracy is the assembly. And in Greek, that would have been called the ecclesia. But don't be fooled, it's not the same as we think today of an assembly when we think of democracy. Why? Because we only have male citizen, which means that we have two other categories excluded: women and foreigners. Foreigners who, like me, are resident in the polis, right? So I couldn't have voted for both of categories in the assembly. And again, this is not a matter of birth or even wealth. Doesn't matter how wealthy you are or how aristocratic your background is, your ancestors. No one cares about that. In the assembly, it's all a matter of your speech. You have to be a great speaker. That's your X factor to succeed, because you have to persuade the people, as I'm trying to do tonight, right? So that means that democracy relies on a different set of skills. The power really is to the people, but mainly to those who are able to sway the people thanks to their rhetoric. And of course, after such a look to Athens at large, let's zoom in. Let's go to our protagonist, so our woman, Aspasia. She's from Miletus, so she's an Ionian woman. She's not Athenian. She's aristocratic, obviously. She comes from a very aristocratic family in Miletus, possibly of Athenian origin, but we're not so sure because, again, she's a woman. So the information that we have on her are precarious, are not so extensive. So we have to do a little bit of a puzzle, a little bit of a guesswork in here. But we all know that the sources describing Aspasia are pointing to her talents. And her main talent was, again, rhetoric. She was educated. She was a cultured woman, and she apparently had a very great eloquence. So she comes to Athens already with a great background, very different from the Athenian women who are actually prevented from accessing education. Their only role was to generate male heirs and so male citizens for Athens. So she will be very different. And of course, when she comes to Athens, she's gonna meet the leading politician of the time, the person that we tied so close to Athens at the classical age, at the peak of its expansion. And this politician is Pericles. He is Athenian, born and raised, from actually one of the most renowned families, aristocratic families of Athens. So he receives an excellent education. Obviously, he's not just of a good family, he's also a great exponent of this family. We are told that he is also very eloquent. His speeches were very calm, very measured, but also very rational. So he was able to sway the people thanks to his very rational leadership. And thanks to that, he has been elected as strategos, the leading general, the leading office of Athens, for 15 years consecutive. That tells you about success among the people, right? He was one of the 10 strategos for 15 years on a row. So these two great personalities are meeting in Athens, which becomes the new center of the world, new interactions, people coming and going, and obviously, they fall in love. Or that's what our sources are telling. And imagine how this is truly the impossible couple. Why? Because Aspasia is a foreigner and a woman, both categories. And Pericles is the best leader that the Athenians are recognizing for themselves. So he's divided between his very public persona, but also this private liaison with a very controversial woman for the standard Athenian morality. So he's living the conflict in itself, right? Especially in 451 BC, when Pericles is actually promoting a citizenship decree. According to this decree, to become an Athenian citizen, you have to be born out of two Athenian parents. Both of your parents has to be Athenian. So doesn't matter if you're an aristocrat and you are marrying a woman from another polis, you wouldn't be a citizen any longer. Imagine years later when Pericles and Aspasia meet, how he would feel about that, because the product of this love, their future children, will automatically be not citizens, and thanks to him. So public sphere and private sphere that in ancient times are rarely separated, everything public is private and vice versa, they come to a clash with the life of Pericles and his attachment to Aspasia. And of course, as I said, everything private is public. So in Athens, another place besides the ecclesia where you talk about politics is the theater. We still say theater. And this is again another Greek word from theatron, a place where you go to look, where you go to see. And what would you see? A great festival where the whole citizenry, the whole polis, city-state is involved. You have the wealthy citizen contributing financially to the organization of this festival in the honor of Dionysus, the god of wine, which is very appropriate for the setting of today, but also of transformation and theater, obviously. And then you have the whole citizen bodies, again, male only, playing as members of the chorus, of all the people stepping on stage during these theatrical spectacles. So they were rehearsing and learning the part right before the show was starting. And which kind of shows you could have seen in this venue? Well, two different genres, which are both either escaping from the present reality or actually zooming in into the present reality. With tragedy, we talk about heroes of the myth, heroes of the past, the heroes that we have seen from Homer. But of course, we see sometimes their downfall, their flaws, what happens to their distraction. On the contrary, with comedy, we see a look into the present. We see a very forceful political satire where you name your target in front of everyone, in front of the whole citizenry, for the whole polis to laugh about that. obviously, we only have one exception to this rule for tragedy. We only have one tragedy dealing with historical events, and this is the tragedy called The Persians from Aeschylus, the earliest dramatist that we know of. And of course, he's talking about the defeat of the Persians at Salamis. But again, this is not so present. With comedy, political actuality becomes the focus for everyone to laugh and still to think and to reflect. So theater is not just a work of art, as we would think of theater today. We go there to be entertained, to be relaxed, to escape. In this case, Athenian theater, tragedy, but especially comedy, tells us what are the worries, the fears, the concerns of these polis, of these citizens. And of course, one fear is, in a democracy, as we said before, what happens if someone, let's say Pericles, has too much power? So comedy will have such a lot of fun in mocking, really, Pericles in many different aspects, but especially for his 15 years and 15 elections consecutive, and asking if maybe the democracy is not so much a democracy after all with Pericles. But not just about Athenia, we're not just targeting Athenian citizens, we're targeting everybody. So obviously Socrates, and we will talk about him right now, is one of the best targets in comedy, but also Aspasia, obviously, with her affair with Pericles, their passionate romance. We know from one author they used to kiss on the lips every time that Pericles was leaving the house in the morning and every time was coming back to the house on the night. You can imagine how that scene could have been played out in such a blunt political satire as it is comedy. But as I said, it's not just about Aspasia and her connections with Pericles. We also target weird people who are strangely different from how you should behave as a citizen. And one of those, obviously, is Socrates, the one that we connect as the beginner of philosophy as we think of it today. The focus on ethics, on values. What is a value? How do we define justice? How do we define piety? It all came back to Socrates, who had this awful habit of stopping everyone, passerby, in the agora and interrogating him non-stop, question after question. So obviously, he became the very ideal target to discuss what things are going wrong in Athens at the moment. And it's not surprising that these two outcasts somehow, Aspasia and Socrates, were actually friends. Socrates, we don't know much about, we don't talk about it as much, but Socrates actually knew Aspasia. We know from Plato, his pupil, Plato, that he admired hugely Aspasia, and Socrates recognized that she was great and she was well-versed in eloquence, to the point that there is a gossip circulating in Athens that maybe Pericles' beautifully crafted speeches are not his work, but they're actually Aspasia's writing. So Aspasia is the ghostwriter, apparently, of Pericles. But behind the gossip, whether it's true or not, we cannot tell, but obviously tells you the reputation that she has. She is very different from an Athenian woman, but she's well-cultured, and she's also interested in talking, in eloquence. And Socrates, as well, shares this urgency to discuss, to debate, which is the result of Athens, right? A very chatty society where people in the ecclesia are talking issues daily. But of course, if you go against the common morality, the common stereotypes, this is the risk, that someone will raise his fingers or her fingers against you. And that's what allegedly, we don't know for sure, but there are sources telling us about this trial that Aspasia is facing. Again, democracy is not just the ecclesia, the assembly, it's also the jury. As you have in here in the United States, you have a body of jurors every day selected by lot, so that you are avoiding corruption. And these jurors needed to be persuaded. So once again, it's not a matter of the technical knowledge of law, it's a matter of how great a speaker you are and convincing them. Aspasia is convicted on the accusations of providing free women as sexual slaves for the pleasure of Pericles. And of course, another good one is impiety. And impiety is the standard accusation that you will see in Athenian trials when your customs, when your behavior does not align to the common sense, to the common morality. And the penalty, if she's convicted, is death, is a sentence of death. And of course, Pericles was always been very measured, very rational in his approach to the democratic audience, to the citizens. He's leaving aside his political mask, his political persona. And in this case, we know that he's taking upon himself the duty of defending Aspasia. So he comes to the trial, he talks on her behalf, expressing his love for her. Imagine how these people would have been shocked in seeing their leader so different from the public image he had. And we even know that he actually left the trial crying. He was never shown any kind of emotion on the assembly, on the Athenian stage. Again, in this case, Pericles was successful. Aspasia is not convicted, he's not sentenced to death, but their happiness as a couple is very short-lived. Because in 431 BC, there is a new war. And in this case, the enemy is not far away. The enemy is within Greece. The enemy is Sparta, the other rising polis of Greece. And of course, Pericles is thinking that the war will be short-lived. That Athens, thanks to its fleet, is going to be successful, as it was once with the Persian Wars. He was not right, because he couldn't anticipate, he couldn't predict that those ships were going to bring in damage and were going to bring the cause of destruction, a plague. And we, as survivors of COVID, we can definitely sympathize with that in every way. So the plague comes to Athens, and of course, one-third of the population dies. Remember that the population by then has been living all within the city walls. So once again, staying close, not being separated, not being socially distancing, the numbers are rising. And among those people, there is also Pericles, the greatest leader of Athens, dies like his citizens, like his fellow citizens, like a normal Athenian citizen. After months and months of agony, he dies, leaving Aspasia alone with a young child called Pericles the Younger, of course. The Athenians were so appalled by what happened to Pericles, his downfall, that right before he died, they decided to make Pericles the Younger a citizen. Once again, they were breaking a little bit the rule. Remember the citizen decree that Pericles himself wanted? They decided to give him one last gift so that Pericles could die knowing that his only living son, Pericles the Younger, because his other two sons died as well, his only son could have been a citizen as well. So Aspasia is by herself with this young man who obviously wants to become a politician like his father. So we see him in 406 at the Battle of the Arginusae, a group of islands. And in this case, once again, is Athens against Sparta and Persia. And this is one of the last victory that the Athenians will have in this long Trentennial War, the Peloponnesian War. It's the last time that the Athenian leadership shines. And Pericles the Younger is one of the 10 strategoi right there, deciding the winning strategy. Too bad that they cannot celebrate, because when they come back to Athens, they are waiting for a very bad surprise. The people are not happy that the strategoi, the generals, were not able to rescue the other sailors from the shipwreck after the storm following the battle. And they're thinking this is all the strategoi's fault. So doesn't matter if they win. No. They have to be all persecuted in a mass trial, which means all 10 of them on the bar. Not individually, but as a group. And again, the penalty would be death sentence, dying. And of course, we know from Plato that Socrates is the only one, imagine that, raising up a question and discussing with the Athenians if it's really necessary to kill them, if this is the right strategy, again, as he was doing back in the Agora, remember, if this is the right thing to do, if this is truly just. But Socrates is only one, and he's not able, despite his eloquence, is not able to persuade the other Athenians. So obviously, Aspasia has to see his son, Pericles the Younger, die in the prisons of Athens with the other 9 strategoi. And after losing the 2 most important people of her lives, she's also losing another important figure of her life, a friend, as I said. Socrates admired her, recognized her talent, said that he would have gone to her if he wanted to practice his skills in producing speeches, in delivering speeches. In 399, Socrates will share another trait with Aspasia. He also will know how being judged and how undergoing a trial in Athens can be so risky. And again, in this case, the outcome is not going to be so happy. Aspasia was able to be saved by Pericles, but no one will be able to save Socrates from death. The newly born democracy at the very end of the Peloponnesian War decides for a clean break with the past. And since Socrates was very connected to those politicians who were deemed responsible for the spiraling down of Athens, Socrates has to die. The imputation is once again impiety, corrupting the young generation, the young Athenians, and also worshipping different gods than what the city would prescribe. And again, there's nothing Aspasia can do, and she sees another person living her life for good. So, since we are at the very end of this journey, we don't know the date for the death of Aspasia. But imagine how different her life looks now from when we started our talk. Really, back in Miletus, the situation is completely different. So I wanted to choose a musical piece that can reflect this arch, and especially this dire moment that Aspasia is facing, the solitude, the loneliness of her last years of life. So we chose, with the Cincinnati Opera and the CSO, we chose this aria that I will show you in a minute, which is actually sung by Dido in an opera by Purcell. But we thought would be the best way to end this talk, because Dido is asking to be remembered. And that's also what I would like to do in the end of the talk, to ask you to remember about this character. So we will look at the clip, and then we will end with just a brief consideration on this very complex triangle, Aspasia, Pericles, and within all of this, Athens, its turmoils, its agitations, its changes through time. So we are at the very end of this journey through time, through space. We have learned about this amazing, wonderful woman that has always captivated my curiosity because we always think about Pericles, male politicians, but behind this great man there was this great love story. So thanks to her, we see obviously the downside of the success of Athens, which is not just democracy and philosophy, but is also a tale of exclusion, exclusion of women, and suspicion of foreigners. But also, thanks to her connection with Pericles, we see the downside of his private life, this clash between the rhetoric at the assembly and the reality of his connection with Aspasia, their son. And in all of this, we actually see Athens. We see Athens as our own distorting mirror. We see the beginning of democracy. We see already its tensions, its problems, the same concerns somehow that are still fascinating us, that we're still debating even right now in 2022, as I was said before. So I'm hoping you enjoyed this journey through back time and space, because the journey of Aspasia and Pericles talks also about us, about our society, about what we need to achieve still, but also what we should learn from the past. Thank you very much. Mhm.
Are there any surviving speeches or writings in this museum?
Unfortunately, so the question is, it's a good question, if there are any surviving speeches of Aspasia. And unfortunately, we don't have any surviving speeches. We only know of her activity, of how famous she was as speechwriter from Plato. So if you go to Plato, we have a dialogue where Socrates talks about how famous she is for this, but we don't have an actual speech of her. We are also missing other dialogues, similar in style to what Plato does, but from other pupils of Socrates. One of them, Antisthenes, for instance, he dedicated one of his dialogues, to Aspasia. Was actually, the piece was called Aspasia. And unfortunately, obviously, we don't have it because we have such a small portion of ancient text. So we cannot read how great she was, but we can see from these sources that there has been some sort of attention. That was the consensus, at least. Mm-hmm.
Just kind of thinking about, you touched on the fact that a lot of gossip was about her providing sexual slaves, basically.
Yes.
But I was just curious, especially if a lot of your work does center around women through history, the stories that you tend to hear about women in history, that people may be intimidated by, and so oftentimes do kind of have a spin that's kind of like, makes them sound like sexual deviants,
Mm-hmm.
to like discredit them, if that's something that you feel you see regularly in looking at women through history.
Oh, okay. That's again another excellent question and a very broad one. We need a new entire meeting from the very start. But thank you for the question. So the question is, since we have touched upon this gossip of women also becoming sexual slaves for Pericles, one of the accusations that we have seen, if we see this pattern, this kind of pattern repeating in history for other women. The answer is that obviously in ancient writings in general, sexuality would always be the perfect target to really show you how the woman goes against what should be the stereotype. So you would see sexuality bent really to the needs of to the agenda of the author. In the case of Pericles, we also have to think that in comedies, many times in comedies, he's being portrayed as a very lascivious person, as someone with a great appetite. Of course, he's also portrayed as Zeus, the king of the gods, and obviously Aspasia is portrayed as Hera, so they are together. In mythology, Hera and Zeus are brother and sister, which we watch Games of Thrones, doesn't shock us too much, but they were also husband and wife. We see the same metaphor, again, for political accusations. You see the target applied to Aspasia and Pericles. But again, this is a very specific, close look to Athens, to the Athenian democracy, but you will find the same pattern, especially if you're interested in Roman history, if we like Roman history, we find it many times with the wives of the emperors. If you think about Poppaea, the wife of Nero, right? The portrayal that we have of her as, again, a very lascivious personality. In contrast with the good Octavia, right? The pure, beautiful wife, right? The legitimate wife that Nero had at first. Or you see even more with Cleopatra. I know Anthony and Cleopatra, we all have that in mind. And imagine that. We don't know that Cleopatra is a very well-educated. She was speaking 7 languages. She was taking matters of her own. We see that Latin authors are targeting about the fact that she's also a very beautiful woman, and she's using this charisma, we will call it, this charisma that she has to entice men, right? So once again, it's a mirror. Depends on the way you're looking at it, and it's not just a phenomenon in Greek literature or in Greek history. As I said before, you find it time again. And I made just few examples, but again, I think Cleopatra really tells you that the image that we have is not this very well-cultured, courageous leader of her people, having a vision for Egypt. She becomes the woman, the homewrecker somehow, who takes Anthony and leads him to destruction. So you see, it's easy to do. In this case, we know that this was the accusation in this case, it's also that Aspasia is using those women who are slaves, who are freeborn, as prostitutes. So there is also this implication that she's treating freeborn people as slaves, which is also worse. And again, to appease the appetites of this leader of Pericles. But you see it definitely throughout. Mm-hmm. Of course.
It seems like this is a very Greek story, and it feels like a tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
If there's something we should learn from it, I was just wondering, what exactly should we take away from this story?
So that's another, we need another talk just to answer that question. What we can take from this story. My first question, since you mentioned tragedy, very fittingly, I would say that I don't have a clear-cut answer. I can give you my answer, but I would like that all of you, depending, on your background, your experiences, you can take away a different lesson from this story. Because because this is also what tragedy does, Greek tragedy, really. You don't have, black and white. You have shades of gray, not 50, but you have shades of gray, right? So even in this case, I think the lesson that I think we can take from that is that our look at antiquity sometimes limits itself on the surface. So we think we know Pericles because he's the guy who wanted the Parthenon. And since we know the Parthenon, we go to Athens, to watch the Parthenon. We think we know what is the Athenian society looking like. But our pages of history, these nice white marbles are very different from the reality that if we look closer. So it's not white, it's not perfect, it's not so dull, it's very vivid, it's a very chatty society with great lights and great achievements. We can name Socrates, tragedy, comedy, philosophy, the ecclesia, the assembly, but we also a lot of shadows. If we see Aspasia, we can see both. So in my case, it's a sort of warning to look critically, to look beyond what we think we know and what we see, on our history books, but also to remember that it's not just about Pericles. There is really a world, and there is also the world of women in Athens, but there is also this warning that public sphere and private sphere are very hard to combine. And in a society like the ancient one, where you don't have such a clear distinction, where your private life and your behavior becomes a way to identify you as a politician and as a person, that can also be dangerous. So gives us a little bit of a 3D look, if you allow me that, to what we see when we go to the museum. And again, we should look and we should not forget about all those characters like Aspasia, but not just Aspasia, who are there in the background, right? They are in the wings, but they should be sometimes on the front stage, like I am now. This is my lesson, but again, this is Greek, Greek tragedy doesn't give you one exact answer or one wrong answer. So maybe if we talk at the end when we're gonna be done, you can tell me what was your impression, what you thought of it. I think gives us a lot of things to worry about, but also new perspectives on how to look at the ancient, Greece, but also, to us, to our issues. But again, I would be, interested to hear what you all think, because this is how I liked Aspasia very much. But that has to be also your impression, how you reacted to that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how did I become interested in, so the question is, how did I become interested in these topics? What is my background? Did I get right? Yes, just for an audio problem. So this is an interesting story. I will keep it very short. Talking about history books, so I was born and raised in Italy. When I was in the high school, we study Greek and Latin, and we start at the beginning with Greek history, obviously. And on my books, there was this very, very tiny paragraph. I can, I swear, at the very bottom of this page, Pericles, the classical age. Whoa, beautiful. Aspasia. I was like, wow, I've never heard of that. I was 15, so obviously I never heard of that, but I got my attention. And so I was fascinated when I learned that behind this great man, apparently, there was also a very great woman who has been recognized as being beautiful, but also very cultured, very intelligent, well-spoken, outspoken. So that got my attention. I started digging a little bit on the few sources that we have. So I started, manually, really. Not even my teacher back in high school. She was, well versed, but she didn't know much about her. So that gave me the input, and I wanted to know more. And then, my interest in Greek history in general made me realize that this is what I wanted to do as a living. So I went to the university, and in fair honesty, because we have to be honest, I'm on stage, we have to be completely naked on stage. I said, this is a great story. It's not just a tragedy, but it's really about life. It's like a play. So I wanted to write something about it. So I decided to write a book, a novel. It's in Italian, so I will not be quoting it. But I was writing it, and the more I was writing it, the more I became convinced that I wanted to still continue studying, not just history, but also literature, these myths, these figures, these characters, these plays that are fascinating us so much. So I went on the university, and I then needed to leave a little bit of Aspasia on the background. I pursued also, for my thesis, I needed to do other genres, not in classical Athens. But, Aspasia has remained in here, as you can tell probably from today, has been a presence somehow. And then in time, I decided to focus, to concentrate on Greek literature, and especially right now, I'm actually writing a thesis on Greek tragedy. So there is no Aspasia there as a character or as a dramatist, unfortunately, but I wanted still to work on these texts because, again, there are so many great questions and not many certain answers. So I wanted to give a little bit of my answers to those plays from a different perspective. And here I am, and who knows how will be, but has been, again, you see, by chance, but then gave me the curiosity to move forward and to realize that it's not just a matter of what you learn on the books. If you train enough to become a scholar, you can actually work and find new problems and finding maybe new approaches to these problems. So it's also a sort of a creative work. So that's how it came organically into be, even from a very abrupt, very strange start. Yes, indeed. Yeah,
Here,
sure.
uh, the last battle that you talked about with Pericles the Younger, you mentioned that Persia and Sparta were both fighting Athens. Were Sparta and Persia actually allied together?
That's a good question.
Very quickly.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. I decided to restrain myself for the sake of time and also because the Peloponnesian War, 30 years of war, might be quite something to digest. But yes, so we go back to Pericles the Younger and the Battle of the Arginusae, 406 BC, and I mentioned that the Spartans and the Persians are allies, are together. So the question is, are they allies? How this comes to be? This is, of course, shocking because we think of the Spartans and Athens and some other Greek polis, city states, together fighting against the Persians back in the day. Well, throughout the Peloponnesian War, at some point, the Spartans are actually going to the Persians, and the Persian Empire obviously has some interest in giving money, obviously, to Sparta, was not much and needs to be a fleet because Athens has a great fleet. Spartans were infantrymen. Leonidas, with the abs and stuff, they were infantrymen. That's what they were so skilled at. But they were missing a fleet, and Athens had the greatest fleet and had allies, the Delian League. So Persia welcomes the Spartans to this alliance for the very end of the Peloponnesian War. So at some point, it's Athens against the both of them, and you can imagine Athens is losing allies. People are revolting. They want to join the other side. And obviously, Persia, it's an empire, so has finances. So they're giving all the money to the Spartans, the money that they need to build and train the crew for the ships. So that's how we actually have a naval battle. And again, this is one of the last naval battles where the Athenian crews are winning. And you can see the political game that the Persian Empire is making. Think about how history is ironical. We started the classical era with the Persians deciding that the Ionic cities can be protected by Athens and recognizing it. And then, by the end of the same century, the Persian Empire understands that war is more convenient, is not having Athens, or maybe Sparta taking on the lead and freeing the allies of Athens. The true interest is having those two polis fighting together, because as long as they're fighting together, there is no one really opposing the Persian Empire and its interest in the Aegean Sea and on the Ionian cities. So yes, at some point, Sparta, the city where there is no money, comes and begs for the Persian help. And there is this, and I'm finishing, there is this very nice passage of this Spartan soldier, Callicatides, and he has to meet this Persian satrap, governor of this province. And he has to bow down, right? And we have Plutarch, this biographer, says that he has so much difficulty in doing that because again the Spartan is a society of peers, of equals among citizens, and suddenly he's meeting the Persians and he has to bow down and do all and having all those gestures, court gestures, that the Greeks were laughing and mocking. So you can imagine. But yes, money, as usual, is necessary, especially if you want to win a war on the same territory of your enemy, the sea. Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask about Aspasia in particular, not to belittle her accomplishments or anything. Was there anything special about the Ionian culture where she was able to flourish, as opposed to like the Athenian culture?
That's another good question, and again, broad in scope. So the question involves Aspasia's background and upbringing. She's from Miletus, so the question is how the Ionian culture is different from the Athenian culture, and if this is the reason somehow explaining Aspasia's own knowledge and culture. And indeed, you touched upon a great point of this presentation. When we started our talk, we were in Ionia. And that's where, in the Archaic Age, that's the peak, in a way, of Greek civilization. In Miletus, thanks to all these cultures, these frequent contacts, commercial contacts, political contacts, we really see a different approach. And that's where we have the so-called birth of philosophy as we think. Philosophy, for now, conceived as observation of empirical facts and trying to find an explanation how the world originated. So Thales, Anaximandros, these Milesian thinkers were all giving an explanation. Thales said it was the water. Anaximenes said it was air, for instance. And we can see it, they are closer to us because this sounds to us as scientific explanation. Indeed, water was the base of the universe, somehow. We don't have any god, we don't have Hera or Zeus. So Miletus is a place, is a wealthy place, two harbors, plenty of commercial contacts, not just with Greece, but with Lydia and Persia, obviously. Has been relatively independent up and even with Lydia, had a very specific was not incorporated first, so then went to the Persian Empire, but retained a little bit of autonomy. So thanks to this prosperity and this interchange of different cultures, all these factors interplayed in making it a groundbreaking place. And that's where we have, as I said, the birth of philosophy. We also have Hekateos, who we think of Herodotus as the father of history, right? But Hekateos actually made a map of the inhabited world. So you see this attitude of looking at the world, looking at phenomena, exploring, going beyond what you would find in Homer or in Hesiod, right? So indeed, in Aspasia, you really find, I think, the best of the Ionian culture, really where in the archaic age everything was beaming and was developing. The center of the Greek world was Ionia. Only after the victories of the Persian War, Athens becomes leader. Athens as an empire, and so the Ionians rely on Athens. But everything, all the innovations are coming from Ionia. So when we think of the Greeks and we think of Athens, we should look back and we should think definitely of Miletus, Iona, a place that was very refined, or sometimes even too exotic and too soft. The Ionians were mocked for being too soft, for being too used to all these commodities, right? And to being almost too refined. So the opposite of the Spartans, who were just harsh, strict, nothing fancy, nothing too over the top. So definitely I think Aspasia really echoes the achievements of this society. And it's not, a coincidence that she's from Miletus itself. You can really tell that Miletus had something special. Many innovations are coming, even urbanistic. The first urbanistic architecture of history, Hippodamus, comes from Miletus. Imagine the first one making a square plant of the polis. Think about that. Again, this tells you about how productive the exchange of culture and the trade, free trade, can be to a polis. And of course, Athens took it. Mm-hmm.
So I guess, could you say that Miletus was more progressive in thinking of like educating women, whereas because like I listened to a podcast called You're Dead to Me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But they talk about Sparta and how a lot of women's value is placed on having the heirs, as you said. It's about having the males so that you can make more soldiers, right? So would you say that I guess Miletus saw value in educating women versus what we would see in Sparta?
No, that's again, let's go back to women. So the question, another good question, reflecting on the role of women and trying to find a comparison between what we see with Aspasia in Ionia and what we see in Sparta. For those who don't know, it's true. We think of Sparta as being very strict, militaristic society, but indeed, Spartan women were very free compared to the standard of other Greek city-states, indeed. They had financial power, they were able to inherit land, they were also allowed to have children with other people who were not their husbands if the husband was infertile, believe that or not. They had a firm control on the household while the husbands were out on a war campaign. So given that, what do we make of how Aspasia looks so different from the women that she might have found in Athens? Indeed, Athens, I would say, is on the other side of the spectrum. If you look, we have an historiographer, Thucydides, letting Pericles saying in a funerary speech, the best achievement for you women is that there's nothing told about you. You see what it means? The achievement is not having a good reputation or a bad reputation. The achievement is that you are so silent that nothing at all can be said of you, that you are on the background. That tells you what is the expectation on freeborn, upper level women. That you are good wives, but especially mothers, that you stay in the household, you don't receive education. Again, you cannot inherit land as in Sparta, so that means that if your father dies or if your husband dies, you don't inherit anything. You are passing to the control of the closest male relative. Imagine that. So this is the normal situation that you will find in Athens. Definitely in Ionia, the situation, as I said before, was a little bit relaxed. I wouldn't say to the point of Sparta. We don't see them having the same rights in terms of, again, in terms of inheritance, in terms of control of the household. And that explains why the Greeks in general were so shocked talking about Sparta. Sort of a love and hate relationship. Sparta is great, we love it, but it's also very different from how we do things, because Spartan women exercised. Can you imagine a Greek man looking at these women wearing a sort of a bikini, and just exercising to be fit mothers, to be healthy mothers for healthy children? Imagine the shock. I wouldn't say to that extent, but definitely the situation for women in Ionia was way better than the situation you would find in Athens. And that explains also why Aspasia was shocking. Imagine, as I said before, the anecdote of her kissing her husband, right? If you imagine that, and again, the expectation that you shouldn't be talked about. So if all the city gossips about how in love you are with your husband, you're not a good woman for the Athenian stars. So imagine how they were shocked when they saw how she was involved somehow in this, relationship with Pericles. So yeah, and that gives us also something to think about when we say the Greeks is such a wide label, right? But we should be specific, because you see, it's like the United States. 50 states are not all the same. Different traditions, different languages, climates. This is the same. So Ionia is a very different place than Sparta, and in time, Athens becomes also a different place. Sure, if I were a woman in the ancient time, I would have loved to be in Sparta or in Ionia, definitely, but not in Athens. And that is, the other face of the coin. You have democracy, but you also have women who are not educated, who are not able to, who are expected to be loyal, but they're also expected to be okay with their husbands having a concubine living in the house, and a concubine living in the house with their children. Imagine that, okay? So very different mindsets than what we would think of, indeed. Of course. I blabbed too much. It's time to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So a couple other thank yous. As always, Urban Artifact, and thank Andrew and Devin, our AV guys from Radio Artifact, for putting this on. And as a reminder, we stream this live and we record it. So if you ever want to go back and see this presentation or any of our others, you can go, excuse me, to YouTube or Twitch and go to the Radio Artifact channel, and you can see those presentations. Next month, Wednesday, November the 2nd, we're going to talk about saving the plants. Excuse me again. It is estimated globally that 40% of all the plants are in danger of extinction. So our speaker is going to be Valerie Pence, who is Director of Plant Research at the Cincinnati Zoo Crew. And she is going to talk about the global threat and what they're doing at the Cincinnati Zoo
to try to save some very specific, highly endangered plant species. So please join us then for that. I think that'll be a very interesting topic. And again, thank you for coming tonight, and thank again for Cecilia for a great presentation. Have a safe evening.
Thank you.